where am I going? This is my drive. If you go to the student resources, like assignments folder, if anyone cares, I threw in like this weird, under like things to live model for your assignments. I just like threw in this weird stash of images in case you guys want to pitch in. But the first thing it seemed like people were interested in, I see people doing a lot of plushies and stuff for assignments and whatnot. So it seemed like maybe a good place to kind of jump into organic modeling. So I do have this like weird collection of plushies. Does anybody have a particular preference in the plushie that we model today? Which one is that? Oh, this dude?
Either of them.
Which? Oh, wait, I actually just did this one in the last class, and I would love to not do it again, but I would totally do this guy. Can we also just really quick talk about Lemon Plushie Shark? I don't even, like, it's so cute. It's like a little ridiculous. Anyway, alright, so I'll do this dude. Alright, so, half the time, so I kind of like plushies as an example because, like, they're still organic shapes, but if you think about how they're physically constructed, you pretty much start with flat fabric, cut out some shapes, and like bend the fabric to make them. So I feel like they're kind of like tangible in the sense that they do come from flat shapes. So a lot of times I'll start, if I'm doing like plushies in particular, where am I going? I made incredibly convoluted file paths. Alright. He's so angry. So a lot of times, like with plushies, I'll sort of start out with flat planes based on how it looks like the pattern was made, and if that makes sense. For some reason, I start out modeling most things, well, not most things, but many things from just flat planes. So if I'm doing plushies, one thing I like to do is, again, I'll just sort of like start blocking out planes in whatever shape. Like if I see a seam in the fabric, I'll put a plane there. So in this case, it looks like he has like a weird sort of cheek cut out here. So most times if I start, and this is, I'll go over this like again when I do the bit about modeling ahead, but most times I will start out from a cube or something flat as opposed to a circle. Circles are evil and I kind of hate them. So just for this is my disclaimer on like why it is good to start out with squares compared to spheres. So if I need to add an edge loop on a sphere, it's really straightforward to do that. Like I just go in, I'm like insert edge loop tool, it's gonna drop one loop around the entire model. They're usually straight, fairly logically laid out, and then it ends up just kind of making like a little grid shape. So it's like, it's relatively easy to manage and predict where those loops are going to be, if that makes sense. So on a sphere, it's like not horrible when you first start. So help me. Why are we, what the heck? All right, I'm gonna anger create a new sphere. All right, so if you're doing a sphere, that was weird. So if I insert an edge loop tool on this, you can see it pretty much stops because it hits a try at the top, so the edge loop tool just stops, which in and of itself isn't horrible. What gets a little weird with spheres is like if you add, so if I add another edge loop, you can see it's kind of hits a quad, and then it hits another try, and then it sort of stops, and then if I add another edge loop, it starts wrapping around the whole sphere. So it does, like, depending on what you're making and how many loops you're modeling, it does get really, really hard to control where those loops end up running. And usually if you have stuff that's like shooting weird places in your model you're not expecting, you just like end up with weird creases and stuff like that, which is why, again, usually I would recommend just starting from a cube. The other thing that you'll also see, so like if you, I mean, well, bad example, but a lot of times if you start from a sphere, you will see like right on the top of whatever you're making, you'll see like that little pull from that star there. Whereas on a cube, you wouldn't have that. So does that make sense? Like any questions about that? All right. If you guys do ever need, so you can make what's called a quad ball, which is basically a sphere made from a square. So if I'll take this cube and I will just go to mesh, smooth, and you can see that it's like subdivided it, where it's like added more geometry and started to make it more of a rounded shape. If I do that again, you can see at this point it's basically just like a sphere, but it's made of quads. So if even this is going to be like way easier. So for one, it's not going to have that like little star that's going to cause like weird pulling on your stuff. But if I add in edge loops, you can see that they're also behaving like pretty predictably, where they're just like running front to back, side to side. They're not, and me adding like one loop here isn't going to cause this to like make another loop that's going to like shoot something across the top of my model. So quad balls are nice if you need to start from a sphere, if that happens to be relevant to your model. So that's, why can I not, there we go. So that's pretty much my shtick on spheres versus squares. When in doubt, I would say probably just start from like a cube or similar. It's kind of counterintuitive, but like, I don't know, in my experience I've just found it to be so much easier to deal with. Alright, so back to this little plushie dude. So again, I'm just going to kind of block in like individual patches of fabric. So I just started with like this really ugly plane, and I'm just going to kind of extrude out some more geometry to sort of help shape this thing up. And I'm just starting out like pretty rough with this. Just be like, aha, perfect, it's glorious. All right, and then just sort of move this. So, I mean, you can see where it's like starting to become like the shape of that little rounded patch. Yeah. And just again, just sort of go around and just kind of keep doing this until it is very roughly like the shape that you want. All right, close enough. So I didn't look super closely at how this guy was constructed. So it looks like from this, the top of this is, if I were to open this in Microsoft Paint, because I don't have real photo editing capabilities at this point, it looks like the top of this guy is basically like his whole, oh wait, no, okay, they do have a seam here. All right, so they have like one seam running along his head. So at that point I might go in and be like, all right, I'm gonna sort of push this out to a side. And then I'm going to start with maybe just another sort of somewhat random-ish plane. I'll center this on the axis. And move that up somewhere kind of closest to the top of the head. And I'll just come in here and like throw this right here. And then pretty much just like more or less match up the vertices to where they were before. I could totally just like extrude this and bridge that across. Like honestly, that would probably make more sense, but for some reason my brain is telling me to do this right now. So I'm basically just, again, just sort of making the shape of the top of his head by extruding this little plane and just roughly matching it up to the sides on that other little cube that I made. So now I have, you can see kind of like two very sort of square versions of this little dinosaur's head. If I go in and I add, I want one edge loop in the center of this piece, which I didn't really set up. I should have just set that up when I first made the thing. So what I'm going to do is just go in, do Insert Edge Loop tool, and if I go into my top view, I can actually vertex or grid snap this directly to the center of this plane. So if I, you can access the grid snapping options up here with these little, what the heck, what are these called? Magnet things. These are all your snapping options. I'm just going to hold down X as I move this, and you can see that it's snapping it directly to the grid line. So now I have a loop running directly down the center of this dude. And at this point, what I can do is basically just scale this slightly larger, and you can see that that pretty immediately starts to round out the sides of his head. And at this point, like I might be like, well, this is kind of a weird place for this particular loop. It seems like the seam is kind of running this way. And if you look at the rest of them, so any questions on any of this so far? All right. Maybe just pull some of these dudes up. So it does seem like, if you look at the side of this guy, it seems like he definitely has a seam going down his back, and it's pretty much just like a little leg and a tail. So it's like a weird like triangle with a tail, basically. So I'm just going to block that in with another cube, or another plane. I'm, for some reason, again, very much a fan of like planes and rectangles. So I'm just going to be like, hey, it's a cube. It's beautiful. All right. So like here's part of his body. I'm going to throw in another edge loop because I need one little loop down here for the foot. So like if I grab, not that, hello. If I drag this down like this, I can just take this little loop here and extrude out a sad little dinosaur foot. And I mean, you can kind of see that it's like sort of starting to look like a dinosaur, kind of. It looks a little ridiculous, but we're gonna fix it. So at this point, what I'm gonna do is just, you know, shift this out slightly so it's like kind of lining up with the rest of his body. And do a little bit of light shaping with just like the curvature of his back. And also just like mostly just pull that little vert there in, and I'll extrude that face. And again, I want this to be lined up directly down the center of the axis here, so I'm just going to hold down X for vert snapping and just snap that directly to the grid here. And then I'm gonna come through and be like, all right, what if I pull that out and like drag it up so it's kind of sort of matching the rest of his body a little bit. And I might also just like extrude his little tail piece down because it seems like a reasonable thing to do, to maybe extrude that. Or I could just, I'll just draw it down, what the heck. All right, so now we have like a very, very awkward little dinosaur plushie. At this point, again, I might just sort of go through it. The time for shaping looks like it is kind of here, so I'll just kind of grab this little foot area and just like drag that out. And you can see that it's already starting to take on a little bit more like form or shape to it. He's at least slightly beveled. And then I would pretty much just keep doing that for the rest of his body. So like in this case, it looks like he might have, you know, a solid patch of white under his chin. So I would go through and just sort of add that in. Where am I doing? Plane. In this case, yeah, okay. I'm actually gonna set it up with one subdivision on the height, because that'll actually give me a subdivision where I want it. So I'm just gonna grab this guy, drag it over, and I'm gonna duplicate this so I don't need to remake it. So I'll just grab this, and again, just sort of position it, position the little vertices kind of where his jaw roughly is. So here's like sad little bottom face I made in. You will notice like the normals are reversed, so like right now they're pointing towards the inside of the dinosaur's body. So I'm just gonna do a mesh display reverse. And I might just, you know, go ahead and be like, hey, what if I'm also gonna turn on symmetry. So in case you never use symmetry, it's like right under the deform menu. But there's object symmetry, which operates pretty much like when I went over world versus object space last week. That's going to operate on, if the object is rotated, it's still going to keep the axis like centered on the object, if that makes sense. World space is going to be like hardcore world space. Honestly, for something like this, they pretty much do the same thing, so I'm just going to use object Z. All right. I always test my axis. I'm just like, I click on one side. If it doesn't select the other side, I try a different axis. And that's like honestly how I keep track of symmetry. But yeah, so I'm just gonna kind of like position these a little bit closer to where they maybe should be and be like, cool, now we have like a very awkward little jaw for this dinosaur. And you can already kind of see that like his shape is, his general shape is starting to come together like pretty sadly. And you could totally just, if you wanted to like start from a cube, you could. I don't know why, just for some reason I like doing this with plushies because it feels a little bit like silly virtual sewing somehow. Alright, I'm gonna turn off the grid because it's annoying me. So I have that other little plane I duplicated, and I'm just gonna throw in his little stomach really quick. If you will let me select the edges. Pretty much doing the exact same thing I've been doing, where I'm just gonna like grab these guys and kind of move them into place. With this one, I'm just gonna, I would like maybe a few extra edge loops in here, so I'm just gonna grab these lower edges and just extrude them down instead of dragging them all the way down. And it looks like that pretty much carries, I would guess, more or less all the way under his body. So I'm just gonna kind of keep extruding. I'm just gonna keep going with this until it does something that maybe resembles a tail. And then usually tails will end up terminating in pretty much like a triangle. So like if you squish the edges together like this, by the time that the tail is done, it'll end up having like a nice sort of rounded effect to it. If you're doing like, again, like actual plushy fabric sewing stuff. So here we have like more or less this very awkward little dinosaur. I'm just gonna go in and again kind of do a little bit more shaping with the bottom of this guy. And then he also does have, those are little red feet. Okay, yeah, so he has like another little patch of red feet, so I'm just gonna extrude him some like little feet continuations. I never said they were gonna be super pretty. Alright. So at this point, probably there's not really a whole lot more I can do to this guy, so I will start actually adding some of these guys together. Save my file. So I'm just gonna grab these guys and duplicate them, and I will just throw these. So basically they're only on one side of the body, I just want to duplicate them over to the other side. The easiest way to do this is just going to be, since there's two of them, I'm going to do Control G. If you look in your outliner, you can see it's put both of them in a group. By default, groups always start out with a pivot point on the origin, so I know that if I scale this on the -1, it's going to basically mirror them perfectly across the origin. Any questions on how I did that? All right. Or anything else I've gone over at this point? All right. Just make sure, so usually if you do a negative scale for something, most times my immediate reaction is, okay, I want to go through and like permanently freeze that, because sometimes negative scales do like weird stuff to your normals, etc. So I'm just going to right click in my channel box, go to freeze, and scale. And you can see that it set the scale, instead of -1, it's now 1, so it's pretty much permanently attached here. So you can see that like as soon as I did that, it turns these black. Basically, it's like reverse the normals of these pieces. So if you just go to mesh display and reverse, it'll correct that. And now this glorious little dinosaur is facing the correct position, or the correct direction. And at this point, again, I would like to actually start attaching this dude together, because he looks a little ridiculous right now, obviously. So I'm just going to I'll start with the red parts of his sides. I'll start here. I will do mesh combine. And then, so I mentioned if you do a mesh combine, it'll drop some like weird extra stuff in your outliner. So like if I delete that, it's going to delete half my model. So if I do a mesh combine, my pretty much immediate reaction is to delete history on that object. So just edit delete by type history. And you can see it also got rid of that extra sort of crud in the outliner. But these are one piece now, so if I smooth it, it kind of, you can still see he has like a crazy ridge on his back that's like totally not as smooth as I would want or expect. And that's just because these vertices are not attached together. If I, hang on. Alright, so like, they look like they are attached because of symmetry, but they're actually not. So I just need to go through and select those and do a merge to center. And you can see as soon as I've done both of them, the back rounds itself out and actually looks reasonable. So I think actually it might, that first time when I was like, it would totally be nice to like, you know, extrude the tail out, I think I might actually go back and do that. So I'm looking at the tail, like when I look at this little dinosaur guy, it seems like he has a little bit of like creasing and folding on the tail, so I would want, ideally I would have edge loops to actually reflect that in the shape of the guy. Because if I have loops running there, it's going to make it easier to model in those folds. So in this case, I'm just going to grab this vert here and maybe bring this guy down and turn off symmetry. And then I will just extrude out a very awkward little tail nub for this little dinosaur guy. I got nothing like super crazy fancy here. Just a sad, I forgot the other half of him. All right, and this is why I like every time I'm doing symmetry, just like watch out that you don't accidentally turn it off, or like sometimes if you reopen Maya, it'll turn off your symmetry and then you're like, ah crap, I gotta go through and like rejigger everything so it actually fits together correctly. So now I have the sad little dinosaur guy. Next easiest thing to attach is going to be these like top parts of the head here. So I'm just gonna do, again, just mesh, combine, delete my history. I'm using the hotkey, which is like Alt-Shift-D to do that, because I like hotkeys. So at this point, I've actually lined up, so like, I've been doing my best to kind of line this up in terms of like seams on the model. So what I could do if I wanted to is, I'll just grab, like I could grab, man, I'm gonna do the wrong ones. All right. Wow. I could grab these edges and bridge them together, like this. And then if I added a single division in there, I mean, so it looks really weird when you smooth it, but I could take that division and sort of push it down. Like if I did need to model a seam in, by the time I got a few more edge loops in, this is like a pretty good way to do it. Again, just sort of by modeling the, like if you have topology running where the seam is on the actual model, it does make it really easy to actually model in that detail if you need it. Or like if the, if you had like a different type of seam, like imagine this is like the corner of a pillow or something like that, where it's like, you know, thick pieces of fabric sort of glued together. You could grab that and just extrude the entire seam, and then when you smooth it, you have that little bit of like raised seam detail on the edge of this plushie. So that's sort of like why I've been tracing the topology lines. In this case, you could also just go back in and like sort of manually add that in later, like if I just sort of, you know, merged all these guys to center, which is like probably the more rational place to start with this. And then I still have the geometry where like, I could go back in and add loops to sort of fix that if I wanted to. But now I have this like weird head. It smooths. It kind of looks like a head. I'll add in the bottom piece because I completely forgot that existed. So again, just mesh combine. And then for this bottom piece here, so I didn't do a particularly good job paying attention to the fact that I had 3 subdivisions here, so I do need to go back in and be like, edge loop tool, yay, and now I have loops. So I'm just going to go back and do pretty much the same thing I did last time, or at least in the end, and I'm just going to do merge to centers on these guys, and I'm just selecting the vertices using the merge to center tool and hitting G to repeat the last command that I did. So again, so we look at this, and now we have like a weird, very sad looking little shape of a dinosaur head. If we wanted to add in the body to this guy, so you can see, I mean, like these verts line up, these guys line up. I need one more loop in here. So I'm just gonna go and casually throw another loop in. And I'm actually, so like this will help if I just sort of drag that out. It's gonna round out the head a little bit while I do stuff, which looks a little bit less terrifying. Only a little bit. And again, I'm just gonna grab the body, do mesh combine, delete my history on the object, and then just sort of somewhat lazily, just merge all of my vertices together. So okay, like depending on how you like working, you could totally just start from like a single shape. I just thought like the plushie is like kind of an interesting way to maybe like visualize how the object is constructed, if that makes sense, and sort of construct it in that way with the topology lines matching things. But I mean, you can see it's like it is becoming more sort of fluffy dinosaur-like. So if I wanted to go in and like add in the body of this, again, I'm going to need some more edge loops in the body. So one thing I actually don't think I mentioned before. So this is what happens if I just insert an edge loop tool regularly. So I just, you know, click, drop an edge loop in. If you hold down Shift, and this is still just like insert edge loop tool, if you hold down Shift and then you insert an edge loop, it might be a little bit hard to see here, but it is actually sort of changing the profile of that mesh a little bit. So it might actually be more obvious here. So if I, again, just like regular click, you can see it just pretty much drops an edge loop. These edge still appears pretty hard and pretty straight. If I shift and add that loop, you can see that it sort of curved the edge a little bit. So if you guys are ever doing stuff like this where you just like need to add an edge loop, it might save you a little bit of time if you use, I mean, that was questionable. Usually it doesn't behave that poorly, but it could potentially save you a little bit of time in like reshaping if you use Shift as you do that. In this case, it seems to break my mesh and make it look terrible, so I'm not doing that. But yeah, so I pretty much have matching edge loops now, so I'm just gonna go, again, mesh combine, delete my history, and merge all of these stupid things together. Oh yeah. 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 And I'm gonna leave the legs for a minute. because I need to add in some more geometry for them. Such a weird looking little tail I've put on this poor thing. Alright, so it's a leg. Okay, and then I need one more loop here because I did some weird stuff to the tail. So again, like depending on how you like working, you totally could have just started from a cube when working with this. It just really kind of depends on, again, preference of workflow. What have I done here? Yes. All right, so, okay, that's what I was doing. So at this point, I'm just gonna, like, he has, you know, it looks like his feet are, like, actually have some dimension to them. So I'm just gonna use the append polygon tool and just close off these feet. Because I do want to maintain that, like, kind of square shape in this case. So I'll just append these little holes together. And one thing, for some reason I noticed that the append polygon tool doesn't seem to pay attention to symmetry at all, so like you just have to do it to both sides of the body, which is kind of annoying. And then also, obviously I would like this to not have a hole here, but I also, in this case, I'm just going to try to keep it to be quads, so I just shift inserted another edge loop tool right there, so that when I close this, it'll be a little quad. And I will do the same thing under his tail, I guess. It doesn't super matter where you do that. Boom, close that up, quads. Yay, quads. All right. So now we have like our awkward little dinosaur. You can see kind of, oh god. The bit where the append polygon tool doesn't work on symmetry stuff, and I literally forgot immediately as I was saying that. All right. So now we have like our very awkward little silly dinosaur here. Just hanging out doing something. And I just sort of like threw in this quad here, just mostly because I didn't want to try, but yeah. Actually, all right. So I look at this now, and I'm like, for one, there's this like it looks a little bit weird and like kind of funky. So like, if I add a loop in below the foot, it seems like kind of weird that it would run all the way around his body like this. So I'm looking at this and I'm also like, okay, cool, there's like a giant 6-pointed star here, which is kind of gross and unnecessary. And I was looking at this, I'm like, I could just draw in lines like this, and that would keep this quads, fix this weird floating vertice I have here, and that would fix many things. So I'm just going to go in with my multi-cut tool, and pretty much draw, so like from this little edge here, down to here, and then I will multi-cut this line to here. I mean, this looks kind of trashy right now, but if I get rid of this and all of these, and again, I'm just control deleting these, but you can see that now I have this little line of quads that runs through the red part of his body and kind of like above his tail. I do have this one strange little end on here, so I'm just going to get rid of that. But now we have a fairly reasonable little dinosaur with like fairly reasonable edge flow for his body. Does anyone have any questions about like how I've gotten to this point? All right. This is like, I guess, also just sort of like, a lot of times you will just sort of start from a cube or a square or like some, you know, similar simplistic shape. Like, you wouldn't necessarily look at this and think like cube. Like, I guess it's mostly just like, you know, you might look at it and like your first instinct would be, I want to make this head a sphere kind of thing. But like spheres are kind of annoying. So in this case, like we have the goofy little dinosaur guy, and again, like if I did want to go in and add seams into him, it would be fairly easy because of the layout of this geometry. So like if I wanted to throw in that neck seam, I would just be like, in case I never showed you the offset edge loop tool, if you go to mesh tools, offset edge loop, if you click on, say like this little neck thing here, neck loop, it'll throw in one loop on either side of it, at which point I could grab his original neck loop and just sort of scale that down, and then we have a little bit of a seam on his neck. I could also do the same thing, or like a pretty similar thing, on the for his face loops, where I would just go through, and again, I'm I'm more or less like adding loops to harden his face at this point. I'm gonna, hello. I'll grab this loop and this loop, so it's, again, for this little seam like right in here on his little red part. And I'll just deselect all of the seams on his body. And then I'm just gonna, I was gonna like scale it in, but that seems to be gross, so I'll just like translate that in a little bit. And now you have like another kind of awkward seam on his body. In this case, it does look a little bit weird because it's, you know, the loops I added in are making some like pretty hard lines on his face. So in the case of down here, it's actually pretty easy to fix since you do have this like really nice seam, which is always a convenient place to terminate edge loops. So if I just grab, I'm shooting for low poly dinosaur, by the way. So I'm gonna grab right in this seam these three vertices for that second seam that I added, merge those together, and then I should be able to just get rid of this. Oops. All right, clearly that's running. All right, so I've totally added some like kind of strange geometry in here. Okay. Yes, I need to get rid of that one as well. All right, so this one as well. But I mean, you can kind of see, I'm not gonna spend like forever just like adding seams into this guy, but you can more or less start with like a fairly simplistic plane shapes and then, you know, build out something that looks like a dinosaur. And then most of this is honestly just kind of going through and adding more geometry if you need it, and then just sort of shaping his body into a shape that's a little bit more rounded. Or like for the, I'm just gonna accept that I'm kind of gonna mess up his face here, but yeah. And then like for anything, so plushies in particular, like the arms are pretty much just two little ovals that have been stitched together and stuffed. So as far as I'm concerned, excuse me, you could just sort of, since they're sewed into that seam, you could just like clip them into your seam. All right, excuse me. So you could just like, here would be a little seam on the guy's side, so you could literally just like clip a little arm stub into that seam. And that would be pretty much acceptable because that is like actually how the plushie is made. But that's more or less my like weird spiel on modeling plushies. Any questions on plushies? All right. Do you guys have any preference if we go to, so the other stuff that I was going to do today is